Mara Ellison was 28, ambitious, and fearless. But when she accepted Sheikh Alim Rashdan's glittering offer of $5,000 a week in Dubai, she stepped into a world where secrets were guarded with blood, where Nader Khalil's watchful silence followed her every move, and where Harper Venn would later hold the only key to her final words, because weeks later, only half of her body would wash ashore, leaving the world to ask what truths she uncovered that were worth killing for. Mara Ellison had always been ambitious, the kind of person who refused to settle for small-town stories and light human interest pieces. At 28 years old, she felt the clock ticking against her career dreams. Her peers had already found their niche in respected outlets, while Mara drifted between temporary assignments, struggling to secure her breakthrough. Then, out of nowhere, came the job offer that would alter everything. An email landed in her inbox, addressed directly to her, promising a chance to work as a writer and communications consultant for Sheikh Alim Rashdan, one of Dubai's wealthiest and most private billionaires. The offer was dazzling in its simplicity. $5,000 a week, all expenses paid, luxury accommodation, and access to an elite circle that few could ever dream of stepping into. It felt like a door to another world had swung open, and Mara rushed to step inside. She told only her closest family members about it, though she avoided going into detail. Her younger sister asked questions she brushed aside, and her mother begged her to consider whether moving so far into a culture she knew little about was worth the risk. But Mara had made up her mind. She pictured herself stepping into marble palaces, her byline attached to influential stories, her credibility finally recognized in the circles she had always admired. This wasn't just a job. It was an escape from obscurity, and Mara could not turn away. She boarded a one-way flight with only 2 suitcases and the thrill of adventure beating in her chest. Dubai was a world that overwhelmed the senses. The glass towers shimmered against the desert sun, and the city pulsed with wealth and ambition. As her car rolled through the gates of the Rashdan compound, she felt the weight of secrecy immediately. The air smelled faintly of rosewater and incense. Guards stood expressionless in crisp uniforms, and beyond the gates stretched an estate unlike anything she had ever seen. Vast gardens stretched into the distance, fountains whispered in marble courtyards, and the palace itself glowed with gold-toned lighting that made everything appear staged for a movie. Her living quarters were beyond luxury, a private suite larger than her apartment back home, filled with velvet furnishings, mirrored ceilings, and silken sheets that felt too soft to be real. The first few days blurred into a rhythm of indulgence. She dined on elaborate meals prepared by chefs she never saw, lounged in courtyards shaded by towering palms, and was chauffeured in private cars wherever she wished to go. She told herself she had landed in the center of privilege, that this was the reward for years of hustling in the shadows of journalism. Yet even amid the grandeur, unease began to creep in. There were strict rules laid out for her. No use of personal electronics inside certain parts of the palace, no wandering outside her assigned spaces, and no conversations with staff unless necessary. Guards followed her subtlety, their eyes always sharp, their expressions unreadable. It didn't take long for her to notice that people spoke in hushed tones around her, as though she were an outsider, even though she had been welcomed in. The sheikh himself was a distant figure, only glimpsed in brief encounters. He carried an aura of power that silenced rooms without a word. He thanked her politely, handed her folders of documents to polish and draft, then dismissed her without fanfare. His voice was calm but detached, as though his focus lingered on things unseen. Mara convinced herself it was simply the manner of men with great wealth. But inside she felt small and out of place, like a pawn moving on a board too vast to comprehend. Despite the tension, Mara pressed forward. She began documenting her daily experiences, partly as a professional reflex and partly as a way to process the unease gnawing at her gut. She wrote about the routines of wealth, about the carefully orchestrated displays of power, about the layers of secrecy that seemed to bind everyone within the walls. She told herself this could someday become her greatest story, the kind of insider account that might win awards. But she also sensed she was balancing on a thin line. unsure whether her curiosity would be rewarded or punished. On the nights when she sat alone on her balcony overlooking the glowing city, she thought about her decision. The lights of Dubai blinked like a promise of endless opportunity, yet shadows stretched between the towers. Mara felt she had stepped into something larger than she could fully grasp. The money was real, the luxury undeniable, but beneath it all was a sense that she was no longer entirely free. Something in her life had shifted the moment she accepted that email. And though she didn't yet understand what, her instincts whispered that she had already crossed a threshold she would never step back from. Mara's days inside the Rashdan compound soon followed a routine that looked simple from the outside but felt increasingly strange as the weeks went on. Each morning she was given assignments to draft speeches, prepare polished statements, and refine glowing articles that portrayed Sheikh Alim Rashdan as a visionary leader. The tasks were straightforward, but the environment around her made them unsettling. Meetings were held in richly decorated halls where only a handful of carefully chosen staff members were allowed, and she was always watched, even if no one admitted it. The sheikh rarely spoke more than a few words to her, delegating most interactions to his assistant, Nadir Khalil. Nadir was tall, silent, and intimidating in a way that made her stomach twist. He never raised his voice, yet his presence alone was enough to make the air feel heavy. Whenever Mara asked questions about her assignments, he gave only clipped answers. She noticed he avoided eye contact as though acknowledging her curiosity might be dangerous. Guards moved in and out of corridors constantly, and though they seemed busy, Mara often wondered if their true job was to monitor her movements. At night, the compound changed. Expensive cars with tinted windows glided through the gates, carrying guests who never stayed in the open areas. They vanished into inner rooms beyond Mara's access. Laughter and music drifted faintly through the walls, but what unsettled her most were the pauses in between, moments of shouting, sudden silence, and the echo of hurried footsteps. She was never invited to those gatherings, instructed instead to remain in her quarters with her work. At first, she accepted it as part of the job, but her journalist's instinct gnawed at her. Something important was being hidden from her view. Her suspicions deepened when she noticed how the staff behaved. Most avoided her completely, bowing their heads or pretending not to see her when they passed. The few who did speak seemed rehearsed, as though their words had been carefully chosen. She once asked a housemaid how long she had worked there, and the woman froze before replying with a vague answer. Mara could feel the fear in her eyes, and that silence told her more than words ever could. One evening, curiosity pulled her farther than she knew was safe. Walking back to her room, she heard muffled voices through a heavy wooden door slightly ajar. Inside, she caught a glimpse of two men leaning over documents spread across a table. The words she heard made her blood run cold. Shipments, transfers, accounts hidden offshore. It was not the language of wealth management. It was the language of something darker. Before she could hear more, Nadir appeared in the corridor, his expression as unreadable as ever. He closed the door without speaking, his eyes lingering on Mara long enough to make her retreat. That same week, she saw something that erased any illusion she still clung to. From her balcony, she spotted two guards escorting a young woman across the courtyard. The woman's face was bruised, her arms covered with silk cloth tied too tightly around her wrists to be anything but restraints. Mara froze, her heart pounding, waiting for them to disappear into one of the side buildings. She looked again the next morning, but the woman was gone, never to be seen again. Mara could not explain it away, no matter how much she tried. The palace was not just a place of wealth and secrecy. It was a cage where terrible things happened behind gold-plated doors. Her instinct told her to leave, yet the contract and the sheer isolation made escape feel impossible. She reminded herself of the money, the opportunity, and the risk of exposing what she thought she knew without proof. So she did what she had always done, she wrote. In the quiet of her room, she filled the pages of a leather-bound journal with every detail: the late-night cars, the whispers, the strange rules, the bound woman. She wrote it all down because writing made her feel in control, even when fear coiled tightly around her. But the more she observed, The clearer it became that her presence was not accidental. She was not simply an employee. She was being tested, measured, and perhaps watched more closely than she realized. The Sheikh's money was buying more than her skills. It was buying her silence, and Mara began to understand that knowledge inside this palace was as dangerous as it was priceless. 3 months after her arrival, Mara's carefully balanced life in the Rashdan compound began to collapse. She had grown accustomed to the routines, to the rules that shaped her every move, but inside she was restless. Each day added to her collection of unsettling observations. Each night she wrote more furiously in her journal, convinced that one day the truth would matter. She knew she couldn't keep it to herself forever. That was when she made her first mistake. She reached out to someone outside the palace. She sent an encrypted email to Harper Venn, her former editor in London, a man who had always believed in her talent, even when no one else did. She didn't include every detail, but she sent enough to reveal her fear. She wrote about hidden meetings, secret guests, and a woman who vanished after being dragged through the courtyard. She ended with a haunting line: "If anything happens to me, look into Rashdan's circle." It was her way of planting a seed of protection, a thin lifeline stretching across continents. What she didn't realize was that lifelines can also serve as trails for those determined to silence them. Not long after sending the message, Mara began to sense changes around her. Guards who had once ignored her seemed to watch her more closely. Nadir Khalil's brief conversations grew even colder, his eyes flicking to her in ways that made her feel exposed. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now shut tight. Her movements were quietly restricted, her sense of freedom shrinking day by day. She tried to convince herself she was imagining it, but the signs multiplied. Someone knew she had stepped out of line. Then came the night she disappeared. According to the compound's official records, Mara left on a personal trip. That was the story passed to the staff and eventually to the media. But no trace of her was ever found at airports or travel offices. Her family received vague statements, carefully worded to suggest she was alive and had simply chosen privacy. None of it made sense. Mara was gone, and silence hung in the air like a curtain. The truth surfaced weeks later in the most horrific way. A fisherman near the coast of Jumeirah pulled in his nets and discovered a body tangled inside. It wasn't whole. It was only half of a torso, wrapped in a silk garment embroidered with gold thread. The discovery sent shockwaves through the city, but the details were withheld from public view until DNA testing confirmed what investigators feared. It belonged to Mara Ellison. The grotesque nature of the discovery raised more questions than answers. Why only half the body? Where were the missing parts? The authorities called it a suspicious death, but their public statements were thin and controlled. Behind closed doors, investigators struggled with interference. Security footage from the compound was mysteriously missing from the night of Mara's disappearance. Hard drives were wiped, and phones were switched out. The few workers who might have known something had already resigned and fled the country within days of her vanishing. The case quickly became a puzzle wrapped in deliberate obstruction. To Mara's family, the explanations offered by officials felt hollow. They could not understand how their daughter, who had traveled for a promising career, could end up reduced to a mutilated body washed up at sea. To Harper Venn, the pieces fit more clearly. He remembered her warning, her notes, the urgency in her last email. He pushed reporters to dig deeper, but every step seemed blocked by layers of influence and money. The gruesome reality spread through whispers. Some claimed Mara had been silenced because she uncovered evidence of trafficking within Rashdan's gatherings. Others believed she stumbled upon financial secrets involving international elites. There were even rumors that her death was meant as a message, that the missing parts of her body were destroyed to erase something she had carried. Perhaps her journal, perhaps evidence hidden in some unthinkable way. No theory could be proven, but all carried the same implication. Mara's death was not random, and it was not an accident. What lingered most powerfully was the sense of something unfinished. The discovery of her half-body did not close the case, but instead opened a doorway into even darker possibilities. Someone wanted her gone, yet someone else wanted her found, at least partly. That contradiction haunted investigators and her family alike, leaving them trapped between grief and unanswered questions. Mara had reached too close to truths she was never meant to see, and the sea delivered her back only as a brutal reminder of how far those with power would go to bury their secrets. The investigation into Mara Ellison's death unfolded in a fog of contradictions, and every discovery seemed to vanish as soon as it appeared. The Dubai authorities announced that a special task force had been assigned, but the way the case was handled left many uneasy. The first sign of trouble was the missing surveillance footage. Every inch of the Rashdan compound was known to be covered by cameras, yet the recordings from the night Mara disappeared were either corrupted or wiped clean. Experts who examined the files claimed they had been deliberately erased. Without video evidence, investigators had nothing to show for her final hours inside the estate. Attention then turned to the people who might have witnessed something, but nearly all of them were gone. Within days of Mara's disappearance, several long-serving employees of Sheikh Rashdan had resigned and quietly left the country. Their sudden exits raised suspicion, but when authorities tried to track them, records showed they had already relocated to remote places where contact would be difficult. Those who remained at the compound were uncooperative, repeating rehearsed lines about Mara leaving voluntarily and insisting they knew nothing more. The silence was suffocating, and it became clear that anyone still working there had no intention of risking their lives to speak. When Mara's belongings were finally handed over to investigators, another mystery emerged. Her personal laptop had been scrubbed clean. Dozens of files, emails, and drafts were gone. It was not the work of someone careless. It was methodical, precise, and professional. Forensic specialists confirmed the data had been wiped using advanced tools that suggested knowledge of both surveillance and intelligence methods. Strangely, one item was missing entirely: the leather-bound journal Mara had always carried. Her family confirmed she had taken it with her, and Harper Venn remembered her describing it in her emails. Yet it was nowhere to be found, as though it had been deliberately taken before her disappearance. The investigation slowed under heavy pressure. Powerful figures began to appear in the background, their influence casting shadows over every step the detectives tried to take. Reports hinted that the Sheikh's connections stretched across governments and corporations, and any attempt to dig too deeply risked creating political tension. What could have been a straightforward homicide investigation turned into a delicate balancing act, where preserving international relations seemed to matter more than uncovering the truth about a murdered journalist. Despite the obstacles, fragments of information leaked. Rumors swirled that Mara had been investigating more than just the life of her employer. Some said she had discovered links to trafficking networks that spanned from Dubai to Europe. Others claimed she uncovered irregularities in billion-dollar financial transactions hidden in offshore accounts. None of these allegations could be verified, but the possibility alone was enough to suggest why she had been silenced. People who asked too many questions about Rashdan rarely lasted long, and Mara had been fearless enough to write everything down. For Harper, the release of Mara's final email placed him in an impossible position. He went public with what she had sent him, publishing fragments of her words in a bid to pressure the authorities. The reaction was immediate but fractured. On one hand, her case gained international attention, sparking protests from journalists and human rights groups demanding justice. On the other hand, the official investigation began to retreat further, hiding behind closed-door statements and vague declarations that progress was being made. The louder the cries for answers became, the quieter the case grew in official channels. In the absence of transparency, theories multiplied. Some believed Mara's half-body was staged as a warning, meant to intimidate others who might have followed her path. Others speculated that her remains had been disposed of in such a way to prevent the discovery of evidence she might have carried on her body. A more chilling theory, whispered through underground forums, suggested that the missing parts were never intended to be found at all, their destruction ensuring no trace of the torture she might have endured. The more investigators searched, the less they found. The Rashdan compound remained untouchable, shielded by wealth and influence. Witnesses vanished, files disappeared, and crucial leads dissolved before they could be chased. What remained was an incomplete story, one with sharp edges but no resolution. Mara's death had become less of a case and more of a symbol, a story about what happens when truth collides with unchecked power, the half-body pulled. From the sea lingered as a haunting image in the minds of those following the case. It was not just evidence of a brutal death, but also a sign of deliberate control, a reminder that whoever was responsible decided how much of her story the world was allowed to see. Everything else, the missing footage, the vanished witnesses, the erased files, fit into that same design. Someone had written the ending long before Mara disappeared, and the investigation, no matter how determined, was left chasing shadows in a maze built to conceal the truth. Months after Mara's mutilated remains were discovered, the official investigation began to fade from headlines. At first, her story had ignited global outrage. Journalists around the world demanded justice, human rights organizations called for transparency, and her name trended on social platforms as a symbol of silenced truth. But as weeks stretched into months, the fire dimmed. News cycles moved on, overshadowed by fresh crises, and Mara's case became just another file buried under bureaucracy. For her family, the silence was unbearable. They begged for answers, but each inquiry led to polite replies that promised updates which never came. The official narrative shifted from certainty to vagueness, with authorities eventually describing her death as an unsolved case with inconclusive evidence. Meanwhile, Sheikh Alim Rashdan continued to thrive in public. He hosted lavish events, attending charity galas and appearing in glossy magazines alongside political leaders and celebrities. To the outside world, his image remained untarnished, as though the gruesome story connected to his name had never existed. Guests who attended his gatherings whispered quietly but never publicly questioned him, knowing that his reach stretched far beyond Dubai. Wealth protected him like an invisible shield, and Mara's death became a ghost that no one dared mention in his presence. For Harper Venn, however, forgetting was impossible. Mara's final email echoed in his mind every day, a reminder of her trust and the price she paid for following her instincts. Determined not to let her story vanish, he began publishing what fragments he had. In a series of articles, he described her experiences in the compound, her suspicions about the gatherings, and her haunting final words. The articles drew international attention once again, but they also brought Harper threats and surveillance. Anonymous calls warned him to stop. Emails filled with veiled threats appeared in his inbox. Yet Harper pressed on, believing it was the only way to honor Mara's memory. The turning point came when an anonymous package arrived at his office in London. Inside, wrapped in plain brown paper, was Mara's missing leather-bound journal. Its cover was worn, its pages stained as if they had been hidden in damp conditions. Many entries had been torn out, but what remained painted a chilling picture. Mara had documented everything. The strange restrictions, the late-night convoys of cars, the restrained woman escorted across the courtyard, and her suspicions of trafficking. On the final page, scrawled in hurried, uneven handwriting, were the words, "They know I'm writing this. If this reaches you, it means they failed to silence me completely." The journal reignited the case in public opinion, but not in the halls of power. Investigators claimed the notebook's origins could not be verified. Officials questioned whether it had truly belonged to Mara or if it was a fabrication meant to stir unrest. But those who knew her recognized the handwriting, the details, the voice that belonged only to her. For Mara's family, the journal was both a gift and a curse. It offered proof of her fear and courage, but it also made clear how much she had uncovered before she was killed. Despite the renewed attention, justice never arrived. No charges were filed, no arrests made, and no official acknowledgement tied Rashdan to her death. Her half-body remained the only physical evidence, a cruel reminder of the brutality she endured. The missing pieces of her body symbolized the missing pieces of the truth, fragments deliberately withheld so the world could never see the full picture. In the years that followed, Mara's story lived on as a cautionary tale whispered among journalists and activists. It became a symbol of the risks faced by those who tried to expose corruption hidden behind wealth and power. Her name was spoken at conferences, her story cited in reports, yet the mystery of her death remained unsolved. Justice for Mara Ellison had been swallowed by silence, but her words, preserved in the pages of her journal, continued to speak louder than the efforts of those who tried to erase her. What lingers most is the chilling thought that somewhere, someone decided exactly how much of Mara's story the world would see. Her torso washed up on shore as if to confirm her death, but the rest of her was withheld, just like the truth she uncovered. In that sense, her killers succeeded in silencing her body but not her voice. Through her journal and the persistence of those unwilling to forget, Mara Ellison remains both a victim and a symbol, a reminder that the brightest lights often cast the darkest shadows.